Hello, friends. This is Mr. Hadley, and similarly to Miss Willis and Miss Ray and Mr. Landis, I am going to walk you through a strategy of analysis of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. I am going to do this just talking to you like this. So in college, when I had a poem that I was supposed to work through, this is how I did it. I didn't shoot myself in video. I just had an audio on my old cell phone. And somewhere in the world on some old computer of mine, there are tons of audio files of me talking through the process of a poem. And so that's what I'm going to do with you today with, again, William Shakespeare's 18th sonnet. So even just to start with, we are dealing with two things that students oftentimes have a hard time with: Shakespeare and poetry. And we've put them together for you in Sonnet 18. And so before I even start reading the poem, I have to start thinking about what I know about Shakespeare, what I know about sonnets. I'm not going to bore you with all the details that I know about Shakespeare because I come from a very Shakespeare-driven family. But he did write sonnets, and he's so famous for them that even though they're called Elizabethan sonnets, for the most part, people just call them Shakespearean sonnets. And there's a type, there's a form of sonnet. All sonnets have 14 lines, and they are written in iambic pentameter. So you have stressed and unstressed syllables, and there's 10 syllables in a line. Now, the Elizabethan sonnets are typically 3 quatrains, which are 3 groupings of 4 lines, and then a couplet at the end. And so they do vary occasionally, but rarely. So that's a pretty standard Elizabethan sonnet. When I think about sonnets, I also think about other types of writers who wrote sonnets. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote love sonnets in Portuguese, which is an entire collection of sonnets in Portuguese, they're not in Portuguese, but that's the name of them, that she wrote for her husband. And she was so embarrassed by how erotic some of those poems were that she thought if she named them love sonnets in Portuguese, that people wouldn't think she wrote them. She actually didn't want to put her name on the collection at all originally because she was so embarrassed. And then my favorite poet in the world, Pablo Neruda, has love sonnets that he wrote in the 1900s, a whole collection of love sonnets in the 1900s. Now, his were different because he wrote 2 quatrains and then 2 tercets, which are 3-line stanzas as opposed to 4-line stanzas. And so that is kind of where my knowledge of sonnets comes from. I studied a lot of them in college. And I think if you were to Google the most famous sonnets ever, Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 would probably be at the top of the list on almost every single one of those, except maybe Ozymandias would be a potential for the number 1. But I think this Sonnet 18 is probably the most famous sonnet ever. And Shakespeare wrote some really great sonnets. There are others that we recognize as part of kind of like the traditional canon that we teach, but none more than sonnet number 18. And a lot of that comes from the first line of the poem, that when you hear it, you'll kind of think about all the different places you've probably heard it in movies, in television, in other forms of popular culture, some version of that first line. And so some of this may even be familiar to you as I go through it. Now, I have a very particular process I go through when I'm looking at poetry, and it involves reading the poem 3 times. So not in a row, but I do read it, and during the process of my analysis, I do read the poem 3 times. So I'm just going to dive right in now, I think. Yeah, why not? So I have my poem here, I printed it out this morning. So here we go. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wonderest in his shade, when in the eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. All right, so it's very sing-songy, which is part of that iambic pentameter, and you have these rhymes. So that's the first thing I'm going to notice in any poem is there a rhyme scheme? Before the rest of the form, unless the form is in the title, like Sonnet 18, the first thing I'm going to notice is there a rhyme scheme? So we have day and May, temperate and date, which, let's be real, only geniuses can get away with such a terrible attempt at rhyming. But that's what Shakespeare is, a genius. We have shines, declines, dimmed, untrimmed, fade, shade, owest, growest, and then C and D. So we have an AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. Pretty standard for a Shakespearean sonnet. And so that's going to be the first thing I notice. And then the second thing I'm going to notice is that first line. We have a question. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? All right. Who is this thee that Shakespeare speaks of? And why should he compare whoever this person is to a summer's day? And so my expectation is that in the rest of the poem, I'm going to get an answer to this question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So let's read the first 4 lines now. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Well, already the answer to the question seems to be no. I shouldn't compare you to a summer's day because, first of all, you're much more lovely and more temperate than summer. Temperate meaning like mild temperature, right? So you're more beautiful and you're probably more chill than a summer's day. And while we think of summer as a lovely time, typically when we're allowed out of the house, here he's saying, actually, you're better. You're better than a summer's day, which is a pretty baller thing to say to someone, that you're better than a summer's day because you're more lovely and more temperate. Plus, you get some winds in the summer and it's a hot wind and they do shake the darling buds of May. So they kind of disrupt the beauty and innocence that has just blossomed in the spring, right? So when we think of literature and we think of seasons, there's almost always a point to having seasons in literature and any sort of writing. Or just even movies, like why do most horror movies take place when it's dark and rainy, right? There's a reason for this. And spring oftentimes symbolizes rebirth because it's when flowers start to bloom. So we have just these newly bloomed flowers that are looking beautiful and fresh and they smell good and they're making everything brighter. And then here come these stupid summer winds coming through and disrupting the beauty and innocence of these buds. And so this is the second strike against that comparison. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. And so we've got another period here, right? This is the end of the sentence. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So to lease something means you don't plan on having it long term. Summer is short. The beauty of summer is short. It's getting longer, but we have to think about when Shakespeare was writing this. Summer was, you think of months as 4 months or 4 seasons, 3 months each is kind of a quick hand math. And so your beauty is lovelier and more temperate than summer. You don't ruin the beautiful rebirth and newness of the flowers or innocence, and your beauty lasts longer than summer. So right off the bat, in these next 3 lines after the first line, we get the answer, no. And then he continues in the next quatrain. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. All right, so we've got some personification happening here. A nice literary device personification. So we've got the eye of heaven shining, right? Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. So we've got the sun. The sun is the eye of heaven. And sometimes it's too hot, which you, person to whom the poem is written, does not. You are not ever too much. You're not the extreme of summer, right? Because that is often what is thought of when we think of summer as the extreme. We also think of, by the way, like flings, summer flings. People have summer flings, and then they go away. And this person is not going to do that. So we have too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So we have the sun is the eye of heaven, and also is personified to be a person, a male, right? His gold complexion dimmed. And so the sun goes down at night, right? It dims. It's only its brightest for a short amount of time in every day. It's part of a cycle, whereas this person's beauty is not. And every fair from fair sometime decline, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. All right, so we're getting a little dark. We're getting a little dark here. We have the dimmed sun, right? And then declines, changing course untrimmed. We're starting to see some of these words that are not so great. We've moved from some of the more beautiful elements of summer and starting to think about aging and death and the cycle of life. And that's part of nature, right? There's a reason it's called the cycle of life. It's part of nature. Everything will burn out and die eventually. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when eternal lines to time thou growest. All right. If you ever are curious about when tones shift in a poem, the word but is a good indication that you're about to shift. It's going to be a big dramatic shift in where the poem is going. It's such a simple, short word, the word but. However, it makes big moves in a poem, especially in short poems where there aren't an excess of words, right? And so we are having a massive shift. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. You, person I'm writing this poem about, your beauty, your eternal essence, whatever it is about you that makes me love you, makes me feel like I need to write this poem about you, shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Your beauty is not going to fade, and you're never going to lose possession of the good things about you. Now, this is only possible in one way, which is how the poem will eventually resolve. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. how cool of a personification here, that death is something that brags about people who are wandering around the darkness of hell. It's also interesting, or maybe not hell, but the afterlife. It's interesting to think about death bragging, but it's also interesting to think about the afterlife as being dark, as being shaded. Now, you also, because you're thinking of summer, shade makes perfect sense as a word choice for something that shields you from the supposed beauty that the poem started off with, right? Like, we can think of shade in that way in this poem. And then the poem resolves. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So how can this person being written about never have their eternal summer fade? And how can they never lose possession of what is fair about them? And the way that that happens is through the words of this poem. So long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long live this, and this gives life to thee. As long as the poetry works, as long as people can read poems, you, person, thee, will live forever because of words. Now, I'm going to read the poem one more time and then kind of do some kind of final thoughts about the poem as a whole. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wondrest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long live this, and this gives life to thee. So what's interesting about this poem is it asks a question, right off the bat, it asks a question. However, it resolves that question pretty early on, actually. Like, in the next 3 lines, it's done. No, he shouldn't compare this person to a summer's day, because there are all these things wrong with summer. There are all these things wrong with the sun. There are all these things wrong with seasons. I shouldn't compare you to a summer's day. The poem's not about that at all. It's not even really, in my view, it's not a love poem, right? It's really a poem about poetry and writing, and how frequently writers are concerned with legacy, with the legacy that they're going to leave behind, right? What is a legacy, right? And Shakespeare's saying that, like, the only way to leave a legacy is to write it, to leave it in words. And it's beautiful. However, the poem's really a flex by Shakespeare. I'm such a good writer that your beauty is captured forever because of how good I am with words. It starts out a poem about the subject, but it ends up being a poem more about the speaker or the writer, because it's a flex in such a dramatic way. Like, I'm so good at this that people are going to remember you for as long as they have the ability to read. That's how dope my poem is. That's how good at the craft I am, that people will remember your beauty even after it fades, which it will fade because looks fade, but my talent shall not fade. That's how good I am at crafting a sonnet. And at the time, it's a flex, but the fact that we're still reading this poem in 2020, I mean, Shakespeare flexed on everybody in that poem. And it reminds me of a couple other things that I think about when I read poetry. So there's this poem by Milton called Ad Patrum, and it's a poem about Milton trying to convince his dad that he could be a poet. And by the end of the poem, Milton is writing about how he's such a good poet that now his dad shall be immortalized in this poem, and his father will have no way to not admit that Milton was a genius. Like, the confidence that Shakespeare and Milton have is like, Kanye West would be jealous of the confidence and the swagger of William Shakespeare in the final two lines of this poem. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this and gives life to thee. He knew when he wrote it that people were going to go gaga over it forever. Like, that's a pretty powerful suggestion at the end of a poem that starts like it's going to be a love poem, but it turns out to not be a love poem in the way that we think of traditional love poems. It ends up being a poem about the craft of writing and what, when you're really, really dope with a quill and ink and parchment, like what you can do. And that is, I think, it in itself more powerful than the rest of the comparisons in the poem. Like, most writers, most people, I think, are really kind of gripped by what they will leave behind. And here, Shakespeare seems to understand not just the power of words, because let's be honest, books, poems, music, things are written all of the time. Most of them don't get through the public sphere. So it isn't just about the written word, which is powerful. It's about who's doing the crafting of that written word. And when you're a master, then you can create legacies beyond just who you are. Now, we don't know who this unnamed thee is. If you Google it, you can find all manner of people who believe they know what this poem is. Most places, when you Google it, will probably tell you that the object of the poem is a young man. We don't know that. The poem doesn't tell us. This poem specifically does not tell us. But what it does tell us is whoever this person is, they're now being captured in a moment where they are at the height of their beauty, at the height of whatever is good about them. And like a snow globe, like a Grecian urn, they are immortalized in this moment. They're immortalized at the height, and everyone will know it because of how good William Shakespeare is at writing. And that's not the most optimistic, like, happy take on the poem, but every time I read this poem, that's the thing I think about. That's my takeaway, is like, Shakespeare is letting us know that he is a master craftsman. And he is a master craftsman. I mean, even forgiving temperate and date, Shakespeare knew what he was doing. And this poem, and the fact that we're studying it in 2020, the fact that it is easily the most famous sonnet ever, proves that. And for the most part, if you read a sonnet in school and you're not an English major, it's going to be a sonnet from Shakespeare 98% of the time, because that's how good he was. And he immortalized that goodness in this poem. And so what I would normally do next is I finished my analysis of the poem. And so what I would do in my process now is I would get out a piece of paper and a pen, a G2 Pilot pen, my pen of choice, my weapon of choice, if you will. And what I would do is I would listen to me talking through the poem, and I would start to form my ideas on the page. I would think about the personification, because that's something I highlighted. I was thinking about the word choice, the diction, especially as it moves between quatrains, because each quatrain symbolizes some sort of shift and utilizes different types of word choices. And then obviously I would think about how the poem resolves, and how the poem resolves in a way that isn't really answering the question posed at the beginning, because he answers that question so quickly. And so I would start jotting down the ideas from there so I could form it into whatever it was that was being asked of me by my teacher slash professor. But I like to be able to speak out loud my thoughts before I put them down on paper. But it only works if you capture those thoughts somehow. And so I used to hide, and there was a room at Sac State that always smelled like pancake syrup, that oftentimes didn't have, it's like a Douglas Hall, second floor, either 201 or 212. I can't remember which way the numbers go, but it always smelled like pancake syrup. There was often never a class in there. And so I would go there to do my analyses of poetry. It works on short text too, if you're reading like a short story or an excerpt of something. It doesn't really work for a novel length text, because I tried to do it like in sections, but there's just too much there. But this is a process I used to use in college. So yeah, I think I'm done. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you're enjoying all 4 of these. All right, thanks for watching.